Good morning or afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the National Endowment for Financial Education for the fourth webinar in our Financial Education Innovation and Impact Summit webinar series. My name is Greg Morgan, Senior Manager of Communications. Couple of housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute for the presentation, and we will have a question and answer session near the end. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A button, and we will get to as many questions as we can. We are already 6 weeks into 2024, but looking ahead to the remainder of 2024, our general prediction is this. There will be many exciting opportunities for the advancement of financial education and financial well-being before the year is out. Policies tied to our field are being debated and considered at the local, state, and national levels. At the same time, the research community continues to develop innovative ideas for studying and measuring existing work. And let's not forget, we have an election coming up this year, where any number of issues can gain mainstream attention. To explore the year ahead, we have organized a panel who will examine it from different perspectives. I'll hand it over to today's moderator, NEFE's Managing Director of Insights, Amy Marty Conrad.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Conrad, and I am so pleased to have you all on today's webinar. As Greg said, we've been thinking through what the year ahead is going to hold for our field, and last month NEFE published a paper that we titled Trends in Innovation and Impact, the Year Ahead for Financial Education in 2024. In that paper, we shared our insights on areas of opportunity, particularly for research, policy, and practice. A link to download that paper will be sent in the follow-up emails from this presentation, and you can also find it on our website at nefe.org. Today, I'm joined by 3 of my NEFE colleagues to discuss some of those trends and to highlight areas that we see as crucial to advancing financial education access, quality, and impact. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Samuels-Jones, our Senior Director of Equity. Next, we have Mary Hoke, the Director of Thought Leadership Initiatives. And finally, we have Paul Golden, Managing Director of Media and Executive Engagement. I'll ask each of them a few questions, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions from attendees. As Greg noted, please use the Zoom questions box throughout the presentation so that we can capture those for the end. Paul, I'd like to start with a couple of questions for you. First, what topics relevant to financial education and well-being do you foresee as areas of interest this year for the general public, particularly, as Greg said, that it's an election year?
Yeah, all of them. How about that? Next panelist. No, I think that's really the great qualifier to your question is that this is an election year. And typically when we have an election, we see a lot of influenced coverage and discussion on kind of those real strong consumer personal finance related topics. In my opinion, I think we can expect a lot of dialogue and focus on things like inflation, prices, just kind of on the general cost of everything that's hitting us right now. Interest rates, obviously, they've been unchanged for a little bit, but they're going to move in one direction or another at some point. Any of that movement would be made carefully, but we could expect to see multiple changes within a given year in that area. Obviously, interest rates are impacting the opportunities for home ownership, and housing affordability remains a pretty serious issue for a lot of owners and renters broadly. Consumer debt will be another area of focus. Just last week, we heard that credit card debt reached a record high. Jobs, specifically things like underemployment and unevenness in pay in the job market. So those are a few topics that aren't necessarily in NEFE's area of focus, but something that's being talked about a lot that NEFE has been paying significant attention to is student loans. So in the fall, around September, October, it marked the first time in 3 years that interest resumed accruing on student loan balances and payments were going to be due beginning in October. It was a great opportunity for NEFE to kind of conduct this nationwide polling among borrowers with student loans to really kind of look at the level of stress and anxiety that was out there based on that change. What we found is that half of people said that they were worried about that there would be a negative impact on their life because of this. There was going to be an impact on their budget. They were going to have to make hard choices. 80% said that they expected to have to make some sort of financial change. 23% said that they would have to cut between $500 or $1,000 from their monthly budget. And 1 in 10 said that they were going to have to cut more than $1,000. So there was a lot of significant potential impacts that borrowers were telling us. And this wasn't all doom and gloom. There was a lot of positive silver linings that came from the data, specifically like how many people kept up with payments during the pause, looking at levels of satisfaction with education. So there's a lot of great stuff. And if anyone wants to see that, that can be found on our website under research polls. But this data had a lot of traction and interest, not only within media, but basically the field of financial education broadly. What was unique about it is that it was a poll that was taken at a moment when borrowers really had to think about what those implications might be or how they might feel. So now that we're a few months in, there's very likely a better sense of what those true outcomes are. So NEFE in the coming months may explore that student loan topic again to get a sense of what the realities are. We know that this will be a hot button topic with the election, and related to that and all those aforementioned topics, it's important that those conversations, particularly as they're tied to the election, be driven by what the data show and not just kind of that political positioning. And that's something that NEFE hopes to respond to through its work in data, research, polling, all of that kind of stuff. Beyond those really specific consumer-focused topics, NEFE is going to continue to focus on the things that advance our mission. Policy is one of those. We've seen tremendous coverage over the past year, and we expect to see it continue. Looking at the number of states that have passed requirements to teach a standalone personal finance course as a high school graduation requirement. At the end of the year, we reached 25 states that have either implemented or are working to implement a graduation requirement. I'm having a hard time talking today. It's Monday morning, working on it. And I think we will expect to see more momentum. There'll be more states that are passing legislation that lead to these types of requirements. And NEFE's tracking this legislative momentum on our website. We have a policy tracking map that we're running, and our policy and advocacy team is doing a lot of insightful, thoughtful reflection on these legislative activities. But there's going to be some work that needs to happen moving forward. Now there's going to be opportunities to start to assess how states are effectively implementing these requirements. What are the successes? What are the challenges? How can other states be a role model? So NEFE is going to continue support for this work in that area. We'll continue to stress the importance of quality with these requirements. Thinking about it from a position of growth mindset, we know that we need a deeper understanding of what adults wish they had learned in school that would have made them the most informed or most confident in their financial approach now as adults. And when we have that understanding and that information, that can help us lead to thoughtful, comprehensive learning design, stuff that is tied into the 5 key factors for effective financial education. And it will continue to back the need for these semester-long standalone courses. So that was kind of broad and all over the place, but I think we'll see a lot of very Main Street consumer-focused topics of how people are being impacted financially, but a lot of attention being paid on state-level requirements too.
Yeah, I know that our policy team is planning to release some information on what implementation has been like so far in those states with requirements. So that is something else to look forward to coming from NEFE going into the summer and the fall. Paul, have there been any surprising standout topics or issues, especially that the media has taken interest with around personal finance?
Yeah, there's a few. The one that comes to mind, top of mind, is we've seen a lot of attention on consumer trust in financial services. Of course, this was heightened by the bank failures that happened in the spring of 2023. It's another area of focus through NEFE polling activities where we looked at confidence, faith, and professionalism within financial institutions. What we found during that polling is that just 46% of people said that they generally trust institutions to act honestly and ethically. 42% said that they have confidence that existing policies and regulations are there to protect them. But when we looked at, and we did a series of polls here, we looked at trust in financial services before the well recognized and well reported on bank failures happened in the spring, and then after. And what we found is that faith and confidence in the financial system dropped from 45% to 39% during that time. We know that discrimination is also playing a role in just kind of how people interact with financial services. And that's part of the story that's being told within the media. And I do want to say too, in looking at this polling information, we continue to explore kind of those access deficiencies and challenges among specific populations who are underrepresented in data. For example, our research team has just done a recent analysis looking at banking access and trust in financial services among members of Native communities. And that really brings kind of this inclusive lens to the picture of trust in financial services. And that data can be found on our website as well. But quickly, other topics that are being focused on in media and that I've heard about or engaged in conversations with journalists on, fintech is one. So kind of how the rise and evolution of technology, but also that waning trust in financial institutions is kind of reshaping how consumers are interacting with financial products and services. That also is like what regulators are paying attention to. I've heard of journalists who are really focused on access issues. So this could look at banking and tech deserts, kind of that lens of how inequality limits consumer choice and opportunity. Social media influences as part of that. Of course, the student loans topic. Artificial intelligence, it's everywhere. And journalists are paying attention to what the potential implications might be on financial products. As a field in financial education, we should be mindful and be thinking about what are AI's implications on education programs and learning interventions, particularly as we think about access and as we think about quality. And of course, journalists are going to be paying a lot of attention to those aforementioned topics that are related to the election too. So there'll be no shortage of what people are talking about, what people are hearing and engaging in conversations on.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's such a wide-ranging landscape of concerns that personal finance issues touch on. It isn't isolated to a balance sheet, and I think NEFE's always taken that position, but even more so lately, it feels fairly obvious that that's still relevant. That's great. Thank you for your insights. I want to turn now to Michelle Samuels-Jones, NEFE's Senior Director of Equity. Michelle, how do you see the opportunity for more concretely defining what equity looks like in financial education?
Paul, you teed this up perfectly. And one of the things that if we think about equity in its most basic consideration, we're talking about not only looking at what one needs in the space of financial education, but the starting point. So it's important for us to not only understand and decode and really identify historical practices, spaces of consideration around my cultural context, where I am, where I aspire to be, and coupling that and thinking about that in the space of, so therefore, what do I need? That's going to mean in many ways when we think about this, not just depending upon what we know, but being courageous enough to say, we don't know what we don't know. And so how do we get very serious, very concentrated about centering different voices that we haven't heard from, or voices that we are hearing from, but continue to push forward that are on the fringes, if you will, or marginalized in our society, to say, so how are you experiencing what we're trying to talk about in the space of equity? It's interesting. I'm a retired runner, as I like to say, and I think about this from the space of when we think about starting points. For some folks and some communities, there are folks who have never even been in the race. And so when you think about equity and you think about an inclusive way to be thinking about how we serve, it is more critical than ever that we're understanding, what do we mean? What are the definitions, and not to lock us into something, but what's the language, what's the space in which we're doing this work, so that we're very conscious about and intentional about what are we measuring, how will we know that we've achieved equitable outcomes in FEI&I if we really don't have some arms differently around what does it mean for different communities.
So we've referenced a couple of times access, quality, and impact, and those are themes we anchored around a lot in both the paper, but also in our work over the last 2 years as an organization. So what are your thoughts about how those themes, access, quality, and impact, how do those relate to the equity efforts of the field?
Wow. Such a great question, Amy. When I think about our work and in really advancing equity in FEI&I, those constructs and those themes and those pillars, as I'll call them, are intertwined. We can't think about one without thinking about the other. And in the space of equity, for example, when we're talking about access oftentimes in other spaces might mean just broadening how often and how I'm able to get to something. But if we tie this back to this lens of equity, we're talking not only about more ways to be able to gain access to information, to content, to knowledge. We're talking about the relevancy of that information from my perspective. And so access in that space of FinEd for us means, so how, not only how are we breaking open and creating new pathways and more pathways, are the pathways that we're creating really shifting the information that we have or bringing in information that may be new to us or may not make sense for all communities when they think about financial education and financial well-being. It's the same thing with quality and impact as well. When we think about quality and we think about the what and how effective our work is, how effective for whom? That's the question we have to pause and ask ourselves. It is great that we have rich research and data that is uncovering and decoding how these experiences around financial education are really impacting and making a change in my own information, my own well-being, and so forth. All these really great outcomes that we want. Are there things that we're missing? That's the question we need to continue to interrogate when we think about quality for all and when we think about the impact for all. I've had many conversations with folks in and outside of NEFE to say, you know, when we think about impact, quality, and access, it's almost like it's our chance to move from informed generalists and informed general practitioners to really being equipped precision specialists. The work that we do for different communities that we really want to impact and touch has to have a laser-like focus that is based on, again, my context, my history, the systems, all of these different policies and practices that didn't just exist in the past, but still have influences today on how I think about and how I engage or don't engage the system. And we can't say enough. I think one of the most courageous things that we're doing at NEFE and will continue to do is stepping aside to not be the expert, but saying, who are the voices that really need to drive and frame and shape this work? Who are the voices in marginalized and underrepresented communities that have been doing this work for a long time that we can be the bridge to help really elevate and amplify the critical work that's already being done in different spaces and that we need to continue to partner to champion?
I love that you said the word context. That's just taken out of context, not that meaningful, but you know, adding and bringing nuance to our understanding of how people learn and utilize financial education. That's been a big shift in our field from even the last 5 or 10 years. And I feel like that's a good transition to move along to Mary as well. Mary is our Director of Thought Leadership Initiatives, and a couple of the things she works on are NEFE's Personal Finance Ecosystem and our Financial Education Innovation and Impact Summit. And especially around the ecosystem, that's all about context. So Mary, I'd like to hear from you. How does NEFE think about that broad array of players in the ecosystem as it relates to financial well-being?
Yeah, so first, when we talk about the ecosystem, we are referring to the framework that NEFE developed to make sense of the complexity around all of the components of financial well-being. The premise of this framework is that in the center of it all is an individual who is experiencing a level of self-defined financial well-being, and then surrounding the individual are many aspects working in tandem to affect that well-being at any point in time. So these are foundational factors unique to the person, such as their general skills, their family and culture, their values and beliefs, socioeconomics, geography, all of these things that Michelle was touching upon. And then there's also a level of financial knowledge and access, whether that is a high level or a low level. And then there's a continuous cycle of financial actions and outcomes that are heavily influenced by things like mindset, available choices, and unexpected events. So there are many factors related to financial well-being that go beyond the knowledge and skills learned through financial education. And with many factors, there are many players utilizing a variety of interventions, all with the end goal of helping individuals achieve a greater sense of well-being. Within the framework, we refer to these players as catalysts for change. And broadly speaking, these are individuals and organizations that are working at leverage points throughout the ecosystem, whether that's practitioners working in service of financial knowledge, fintech solutions impacting behavior, policymakers addressing issues of access, or even community agencies that are providing social and material supports. Of course, evaluators, researchers are absolutely essential and are woven throughout each part of the ecosystem as well. We know that financial education is a crucial part of the financial well-being for many people, but it is far from the only solution. And we know that the financial education field also needs advancement in other areas of the ecosystem to be effective. For example, a person can have all the financial education in the world, but without access to appropriate financial products and services, they won't have the opportunity to fully apply their knowledge in practical ways. So to that end, cross-disciplinary and cross-sector partnerships and initiatives are incredibly valuable. We need systems level change addressing each piece of the ecosystem to make the biggest difference in helping people feel a sense of satisfaction, opportunity, and control with their financial lives.
So, Mary, trying to tie that all together is quite a challenge. And I think the ecosystem model does a very nice job, but I know we're trying to advance those connections in other ways. Could you tell me the approach that you foresee us taking at the upcoming Financial Education, Innovation, and Impact Summit, trying to create bridges between those industries and disciplines that have a stake in financial education?
Yeah, absolutely. So with our upcoming summit, we are really excited to create a space for interdisciplinary leaders to learn from one another and build community in service of the field's future, especially as it pertains to issues of access, quality, and impact. While most convening opportunities focus on just one or two functional areas within the ecosystem, we envision drawing together diverse attendance representing perspectives from research, policy, practice, advocacy, thought leadership, and philanthropy. We also want to expand attendance beyond stakeholders within financial education, looking to a broader landscape of organizations and individuals whose missions might just be supported or supplemented by financial education. We witnessed so much enthusiasm and appreciation from 2022's attendees for the opportunity to have dedicated time to engage in person with individuals across disciplines. Partnership among attendees is always a big benefit of convenings like the summit. And we were really pleased to see various partnerships and collaborations come out of our inaugural event. Of course, there will be plenty of networking opportunities to strengthen connections, but beyond that, our desire is to create an environment where attendees can interact with content, they can reflect, they can make what they learn actionable. We want people to leave with a clear idea of the so what, and then be able to meaningfully integrate that into their work. We also want to foster an engaged community that co-creates a vision for the future and then advances toward that vision with some unified goals. And right now we are creating an agenda for that reflects those aims.
Well, thank you, Mary. Those are some big goals, and I think I heard from all three of you that there is quite a lot ahead for, I know we say this year, but it seems like this work will carry us through the next several. So to try and maybe narrow it down and focus a little bit, I want to hear from each of you. What projects, concepts are you most looking forward to diving deeper into in 2024? And Paul, I'd like to start with you.
There's a lot. Definitely the summit will be a culmination of a lot of work that happens throughout the year. So that's definitely something we're looking forward to, and just seeing how that event will evolve from the inaugural one we did in 2022. I'm excited to see how that comes together, and especially because it has this really explicit focus on our identified themes of access, quality, and impact. I think it'll make the conversations more intentioned and more meaningful. Something else that we recently launched that I'm interested personally in seeing kind of how it proceeds and is utilized is we recently co-launched with our partners, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association, an online resource for journalists who are interested in covering consumer finance stories. And, as Mary was talking through the ecosystem, it's really important to note that, financial education that leads to solid well-being is not just passing along information. There's all of these factors that come into play, but information being passed on is still important, and journalists are an important conduit for reaching people and providing them background and context on financial issues that might have an opportunity to help them improve their well-being. So this resource that we've launched with our partners, RTD&A, Radio, Television, Digital News Association, is intended to support journalists who are looking to cover consumer finance in their newsrooms a little bit more frequently and effectively. There's great synergy between NEFE and RTD&A in that both organizations are focused on effective education. So I'm excited to see how that resource evolves and if it is serving a need that we think is there. So that's something that I'm looking forward to. More broadly, as I was talking about, I'm just really interested in seeing what the outcomes from the election will be and all the conversations that will have an impact on consumers' finances.
Michelle, what about you? What do you want to dig more into with this year ahead?
Okay, I have a list of 100 things, but I'm going to shorten that to 4 for the interest of our conversation. So one of the things that I have just truly enjoyed digging into with our policy and advocacy team is really trying to understand and become a better champion for what does culturally conscious or culturally relevant curriculum reflect? As all of these mandates are passing and states are getting more and more bold and robust in FinEd requirements, we also want to make sure that those requirements are delivered in a way that is equitable, that's inclusive. And so really digging in there. And of course, tied to that, how are our educators being equipped and developed to be able to deliver what we would call really impactful curriculum across all identities? That's really important for us to continue to not just track, but be involved in and an influencer for. I'm also very excited about the opportunity, as you asked about, to further put our arms around what we mean by equity and FinEd. And we're going to do that through a couple of concrete next steps for us. We're going to be hosting a virtual roundtable discussion to start to bring together really important minds and thoughts around what we mean by equity and financial education. And that's going to lead to us hosting a convening to, again, bring together folks who are really doing impactful and really, really critical work in this space. The last thing I want to mention is I am so intrigued and excited about the work of our visiting scholars. And I'm intrigued by their work because it is both compelling and deeply troubling. And it is information and research that is really uncovering and challenging us to think not only innovatively, but very differently and without, how would I say this? And without constraints about how we can really change and impact and influence financial well-being for all. And so those are just a couple of areas. And however our work comes together, the work that we do to center DEI and equity and all that we do in NEFE is really just taking root. And that's been exciting to continue to be a part of and to watch.
4 is still a short list, Michelle, so nicely done. And I agree, those are some really exciting projects, and a lot of work I think has been in the collective imagination for many years, but I'm so happy to hear about how much we're going to advance that this year. Mary, finally to you, what projects or concepts are you most excited about this year?
Sure. Well, I echo the excitement of everything that Paul and Michelle spoke about, but I think the thing I am most looking forward to is the summit in October, especially because the field is at such an inflection point where more and more states are mandating financial education, and there's just a true need to explore what delivering quality, effective education looks like on a large scale. As was said before, the summit is once again going to anchor on key themes of access, quality, and impact. And I'm really looking forward to the insights that will emerge from bringing together leading voices in this space.
Thank you all. I'll attempt to briefly answer this question as well. But one of the things I'm most, I think, looking forward to in the year ahead is something Mary said around that cross-industry and cross-disciplinary work. I think that our field has made strides in the last several years to work across industries and become more interdisciplinary. And so for myself, weaving together, especially how research and policy priorities align, and trying to create spaces for those folks to better connect, that's something that I'm pleased that we're doing more of, especially in 2024. I want to remind folks that if they have questions, to go ahead and put those in the Q&A box with Zoom. We will have a few minutes to get to those very shortly. So I am going to wrap up with our last question that I've prepared, and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. So starting with Paul, I want to know if you have any advice or calls to action for the field for this year.
Oh man, that's tough. Be focused. There's going to be a lot of noise, a lot of conversation and dialogue. The election will influence some of that, but there's just a lot anyway with how people are interacting with social media and their social circles and all of that. For all of the advocates who work in financial education, is to remain focused on how we can collectively improve access and quality and the impact in all of our work, how we can amplify and elevate the great things that each other's doing. That would be a big thing that I would want to see. And that's something that just genuinely happens in our field as well. So hope to see that happen, but let's bring the visibility to the legislative activities that are happening as well, and just continue to move that needle more forward. Who knows where we'll be by the end of this year with these number of states who have requirements in place. But then there's the whole part of it is like, well, then how do we do it effectively, and how do we make sure that teachers feel comfortable in delivering the education? There's a whole other suite of issues that we need to be ready for too. So just stay diligent, stay focused, but celebrate and applaud each other and keep up the good work.
I love that you're ending that on a positive note. Michelle, what about you? What are your either advice or calls to action?
I love what Paul said. I would echo a lot of that. And my statement that I typically make and share with colleagues is to look beyond and go beyond, and therefore work beyond. There is, as Paul is saying, there is so much right in front of us that is noise, and clouds are thinking, causes us to come from a deficit place or a fear-based lens. And for us to stand in the gap for those who need us most is the work that we have to do. And that means listening differently. It means cutting through the noise. And there's a quote that I heard from Nicole Hannah-Jones recently that says, to not claim our legacy is to give up our inheritance. And that's what I think our work is about. It is, how are we equipping and preparing folks to claim a legacy that really sets them up for the life that they deserve to live? And so my charge to us is to do that work and to interrogate what is right in front of us and to go beyond and look beyond.
Michelle's always handy with a really good quote, so I expected nothing less. Thank you, Michelle. And finally, Mary, what about you? What advice or calls to action do you have for the field?
Well, I feel like that is tough to follow, so I will keep it brief. I'm going to say register for the summit. Our dates are set for October 8th through 10th in Denver, and we plan to open up registration in April. So keep an eye on NEFE's channels. You can subscribe to NEFE's newsletter and social media channels such as Twitter, LinkedIn for updates.
And Mary, you beautifully answered a couple of the questions we had from the audience around those dates. And again, in his wrap up, Greg will share those as well if you want to see them visually. So it sticks better in your brain. And the summit will be open to the public this year rather than invite only. So it's not a large capacity, so make sure you register early, but we are really excited to host another one after almost 2 years have passed since the last. I think my answer on the advice or calls to action, just before we really transition into questions, I would echo everyone's sentiment, and I would try and reiterate connecting the dots. I think that's what we're trying to do a little bit, just very briefly in today's discussion, connecting the dots across themes, across what's new, across what's been long simmering or brewing. And I think maybe Michelle was the one who touched on this, staying patient and seeing things through, especially those research and data efforts that do take many years to come to fruition. I think there's a lot of really great stuff that's going to wrap this year, emerge this year, that our field really, really needs to see how we're progressing, but also identify our new challenges. So, so if my either advice or call to action could be anything, it is to be patient, connect those dots, and watch for new trends in research that are going to be coming out this year. All right, so I'm going to start us off with a very easy one because we didn't say this during our introductions, but David would like to know where we are geographically. So I'll just say, so I'm based in Washington, D.C. And then Gregory Morgan, who started us off today, he's in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And then Michelle, if you wouldn't mind.
I am in Houston, Texas.
Great. And then Mary and Paul.
We are sharing a wall in downtown Denver, Colorado.
Yes, Mary and Paul are at NEFE's headquarters in Denver. So that's just an easy question to get us started, but thank you, David. So let's see. So from Ruth, do you see fintech as expanding access and equity to services, especially banking, or is the distrust that shows in your polling also extended to online banking as well? Paul, do you have thoughts on this one?
Our polling kind of looked at like general interactions with financial services. So certainly it could have been, you know, in-person interactions, online interactions, and all of that. I see fintech has an opportunity to expand access, but it can also limit it as well. And maybe Michelle can speak a little bit more to the equity part of it. But we do know that there are banking deserts, and there are many people who are not close to a financial institution where they can be served or have access to appropriate financial products. And that's all the stuff that breaks down trust. I also mentioned kind of the discrimination and different things that happen. So it's a lot of different stuff that plays into how people feel. But fintech access, I think, can be helped and can be hindered. There was a great resource I saw. It just came out not too long ago. I think it's the Federal Reserve put it out, much in the same vein of like having a map that tracks information and data. It was looking at where banking deserts are and where near deserts might be happening. And it's really interesting data when you just see how many people must be reliant on fintech to handle their financial matters because they're not being served in traditional ways. Is there something you would want to add from the equity lens on that, Michelle?
I would. Thank you, Paul. One of the things that Amy said that I just want to go back to that is so critical is about connecting the dots. And that's the richness of our work. Nothing that we do stands alone in a vacuum. And so when we think about fintech from the equity lens, we also have to think about the inequities that exist in technology in communities. And so in underrepresented communities, in marginalized communities, in communities of color, we see discrepancies and discrimination and inequities in access to technology. And so when we think about fintech and think about the opportunities there, we can't do that without thinking about technology. And we saw so many things exacerbated with the pandemic and other pieces of being disconnected in that way. And the communities that really suffered were the communities that did not have the same access, ready access to technology. And so here again is a perfect example of how our work has to think across and has to think horizontally, where there are opportunities for sure in fintech and being able to move into this space online. We can't think about that without examining other systems and infrastructure pieces that could either facilitate, accelerate, or continue to hinder access for certain populations in certain communities.
Yeah, thank you both. I want to ask if any of you have examples. This is a question from Charles. Examples of good models for what it takes to make progress in expanding access, quality, and impact of financial education for youth who've typically been underserved. I can begin with this one, and if anyone else has responses, please do share. The example we love to point to very frequently is an initiative called the FLY initiative out of Rhode Island, Financial Literacy Youth. Their program design has worked with schools, worked with volunteers to create a financial education classroom experience that's incredibly reflective of the local community of students who are participating. So they've taken a national curriculum and localized it to be most relevant for the students, understanding their likely economic situations based on where they are locally, and then developing a set of students, a set of volunteers who are there and able to deliver the curriculum, deliver the education that come from the local area and are very reflective of the students and their families. So we love to point to that one, or at least I do, because it is this really thoughtful imagining of a wraparound curriculum approach to me. And something that is extremely anchored in relevance for students so that, you know, personal finance can truly be personal, like it can be anchored in reality and lived experience. There are other, I think, very good state level approaches. I think our policy team can speak to this a lot more in depth than I can, but there are several states with a really long history of investment in financial education and also numerous approaches. And I don't know if any of the three of you have particular programs or initiatives you want to call out. So I'll pause there for comments.
Thanks, Amy. I was also going to identify the FLY initiative. One of the things that I just want to lift up about that work is the thinking truly equitably and inclusively around not just taking a curriculum of finance and saying, here, I'm going to translate this to your cultural context, but even going beyond that and really saying, what does this mean? And how does this mean in different communities? The other example I'll give is work that's being done by SFEPD, the Society for Financial Education and Professional Development. They're doing tremendous work, and I'm putting youth in this bucket as well. They're doing tremendous work with historically Black colleges and universities, and that work, even at the collegiate level, is impacting what's happening at the K through 12 level. And so part of the strength of their work is also doing this culturally relevant, culturally conscious approach to financial education and financial well-being, and teaching college students how to teach others. And so that information is going back into home communities. It's going back into churches. It's going back into a lot of different spaces where youth are. And again, I'm considering college students in that youth-ish bucket, but the work that is happening to develop young people to then become the people who do the work is just incredibly powerful.
That's a great example, Michelle. I appreciate it. I believe we have time for one more question. If anyone would like to type one into the box, otherwise we can wrap up. And to the folks who asked, Michelle mentioned the Society for Financial Education and Professional Development, SFE and PD. So I will share a link to that, or Greg can in the webinar chat. I'll give it just a few more seconds, but I want to know if our panelists have any parting thoughts on today's discussion.
I just wanted to go back to that last question about case studies and those type of things too. And while it's not focused on youth as it is like K through 12 or anything like that, but we do have two strategic partnerships that we're engaged in. One with the Colorado Community College System that's looking at expanding access for working students, and it's like through online skills training. That's a project that is kind of underway now, as I understand it, starting in 2024. And then we have another partnership with the Appalachian College Association, which is looking at implementation strategies at colleges that primarily serve kind of rural first generation students, and all of that might lead to models that could be replicated and adapted. So those are two strategic partnerships that we have that's going to have, I think, some really meaningful and thoughtful outcomes.
I want to thank the three of you as well as Greg for participating today. And thank you so much to our attendees. This was a really good set of questions and discussion. I want to turn it back over to Greg now to wrap us up.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for joining us today. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. Be on the lookout for information on upcoming webinars in this series, which will be scheduled throughout the year as a lead up to our Financial Education, Innovation, and Impact Summit, October 8th through 10th in Denver. If you are interested in watching or rewatching our previous webinars in this series, you can use this QR code to find them on our website. And then lastly, visit NEFE.org to learn about all the work we are doing, as well as to subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Medium, and Instagram. Thanks again, and have a great day.